Well, firstly, this was a project which grew. Initially, it was a project based around the hostels and discovering where the hostels were and who lived in those hostels. As we began to discover that story, it began to grow, and we began to have more and more questions, and more patterns developed in the work that we were doing, which made us realise that we had to look at this in far more detail. Yes, it was aimed at the 45 members and their families, but because the story is actually so important in the story of British Jewry, that I think it's actually a completely important story for everyone who lives in the UK to actually work out why the boys were here, how they made a success of their lives, and how British Jewry responded to them. That's one of the really extraordinary things, is that immediately after the liberation, people were writing down who had survived. They were pinning it up on synagogue walls. They were writing it down the back of board games. They were beginning to broadcast it on Polish radio, originally from Lublin, way before the liberation of Warsaw and towns further to the west. And so, and then the first real official list that was produced in Bavaria by a rabbi called Rabbi Abraham Klausner, and it's called The Surviving Remnant. And he produced this list. He had it in his office in Munich, and people used to come to his office to look at the list, and then they would write their name on the wall and they would move on. So that's how many people trace their relatives. So these lists became really, really important, so that when the boys were gathered together in a group and they were coming to the UK, for example, in the case of the fourth group, the original list was put together by the American Joint Distribution Committee, and that was then handed over to, a copy of it was handed over to the official who was going to fly in the planes. In the case of the fourth group, they travelled by train. That list would have travelled to Paris. It would have been amended because some people were leaving the group and because they found relatives elsewhere. And then the final list would have been handed over and would have sailed across the Channel. And actually, there is still a mistake in that list, because two of those people who are still on the list actually left at the very last moment, and obviously nobody had any time to amend it. So yes, these lists are really, really important, and they were initially published in newspapers, but you would go to certain centres all across Europe to look up the names of your relatives, and that's how people managed to trace people. That's how Marla Tribich was traced by her brother Ben Helfgott, because the Red Cross found her name on a list of having been in Sweden. So these were really important pieces of documentation. In the case of the first group, who come from Theresienstadt, it was a UN list that was put together. They were UN aid workers. They were obviously involved with the JDC, because the JDC were also working. And then it's a Red Cross list. So when you see the group who come in the second group, you can see actually the Red Cross stamp at the bottom of the list. Of those people who were in Bergen-Belsen. And actually the Bergen-Belsen list is very interesting, because the children are all classified by nationality, because the British did not recognise Jews as a separate group, and they insisted on classifying them by nationality and then repatriating them. So many members of the boys who were liberated in Belsen were actually repatriated back to Czechoslovakia and then came in later groups. Yes, it's easy to assume that once you've got the list of the names that that's the job done. Well, actually far from it, because many people came under assumed identities. Their friend had suddenly discovered that they actually had a relative in Sweden, and they thought, actually I'm going to go to Sweden now, but they'd already been issued with papers to come to the UK. So they gave their friend the papers to go to the UK, and so they came under assumed name. And some people came that way. Others, their names was misspelt, and it was impossible to trace them because they were misspelt. There were problems with the ages that they'd given, because of course throughout the wartime they'd had to pretend they were older in order to be selected for slave labour. And then of course when the British came across offering visas, it was first at the age of 16 and later at the age of 18. So everybody who was 20 then had to pretend that they were 17. So actually tracking down the people and cross-referencing them was an enormous job, which I'm very grateful to the team of interns that I worked with, because that was mostly what they did. By the nature of the story, much of the emphasis has been given to the first group of boys who arrived. It was the largest group. and it was the first. So it caught public imagination even in the summer of August 1945. They've also been commemorated by a fantastic local project in the Lake District, and many of those boys did remain in the UK and became very influential. So the story of the Windermere Boys has tended to predominate in the story of the boys. And one of the things we really wanted to do was to tell the rest of their story. So the boys arrived, actually we now know, in 5 groups, and each one of those groups had a very unique and different experience. They'd had a very different experience in the pre-war Europe, they'd had a completely different experience during the war, and a radically different experience after the war. And the reason that they were brought to the UK actually changed over a period of time. So with the first group, it's a rescue of orphan children from a war zone. It's quite simple. With the second group, it's similar, but that second group spent 6 months in Germany. So they had a very different experience from the first group, who'd only been in Czechoslovakia for a couple of months. The second group were living in DP camps in the British and the American occupied sector. So they had a very different experience. Now, when we come to the third group, there are members of the third group who had had identical experiences to the first and the second group, but they had not been included on those lists of boys to come to the UK for many reasons, because there was a limited number of places available on the planes to fly them back to the UK, or those boys had decided that they were going to try to look for their family, and it could take many months, even more than a year, to try to find out whether anybody had survived. And they travelled huge distances to go back to their homes. I mean, it was no mean feat to go from Western Germany to the Eastern Carpathians. And then the story begins to change. As we go into 1946, the story is changing. We still have some of the youngest child Holocaust survivors who arrived in the UK in March 1946, some of the tiniest children to survive Auschwitz. So one of the stories I'm trying to find out is, what had they been doing for the 14 months since they were liberated from Auschwitz? And I'm actually working with an Italian author at the moment to try and find this out. It's an obvious question, but nobody's ever asked it before. And I think it's an illustration of the complication of the work that we're doing. But by the time you get to the third, and particularly to the fourth group, you begin to see that this is actually a story of rescuing children who are coming from a part of Czechoslovakia which had been annexed by the Soviet Union. Now, most of them came from very religious families, and they had very strong Jewish identity. Now, that put them in a head-on collision with Stalinism. So if they had remained within the Carpathian region, they could have been arrested and sent to Siberia. Anything could have happened to them. So the big scramble and the big effort that was being made on the ground in Prague was to get these kids out of Czechoslovakia before they were repatriated back to the Soviet Union. So this is a rescue mission it's a Cold War story, it's a rescue mission from Stalinism. And then we see the group that became the fifth group, which is a very small group, it's just over 20 children, but they were actually rescued by Rabbi Solomon Schonfeld, who actually went back to Slovakia and to Czechoslovakia just before the communist takeover in order to bring out religious children again. So most of the children who came out with him were very Orthodox and went to Orthodox schools. Many of them went again to Canada on the War Orphans Programme and were only in the UK for a matter of months. As the liberations begin from February 1944 of towns in pre-war Poland. At first, the Russians said that anybody who'd been a Polish citizen before the war could do as they wished. They were free to go if they wanted. But anybody who remained behind and was showing Zionist tendencies, religious tendencies, these were things which were disapproved of by the Kremlin. So many of the partisans who were involved in the liberation process, so Jewish partisans, decided that they would lead the people out, because otherwise they and the people they were trying to care for could easily have ended up in Siberia. Yes, and of course we have this. One of the things I think is quite interesting about this story is something else that would be interesting to look into, is because now we know we had so many boys who came from the Carpathians. Many of their extended families and friends may well have remained within the Carpathians, which were annexed to the Soviet Union and now part of Ukraine, and what actually happened to those people during the Soviet period. And of course, we all know the story of the refuseniks and Soviet Jewry. So the story of the problems of the people in the Carpathians just rolls on. It was first assumed that about 5,000 Jews would have survived the Holocaust. That was the first estimate. And then it took people by surprise how many had survived. Then the figures were redrawn up. And it was then estimated that 5,000 children had survived the Holocaust. That's why the British government offered 1,000 visas, because it was fair. The Americans were going to offer 1,000 visas, the Swedes offered 1,000, the French offered 1,000. So it looks awfully mean in retrospect, but actually it wasn't. And then over the months, it began to become clearer and clearer that there were far more children. But by the point that had happened, many people didn't want to come to Britain because of British policy in the Palestine Mandate. So many of the survivors actually regarded Britain as the enemy as the months dragged on after the liberation. I mean, I think one of the things you have to remember is that they'd had no news for since a lot of them since 1939. So although they knew it was difficult to go to Palestine in the 1930s, they didn't realise how the situation had changed. They assumed that they'd be allowed to go where they wanted. And then, of course, there was illegal immigration to Palestine, which took thousands and thousands of survivors illegally to smash through the Royal Naval blockade. So yes, you could get there that way, but also many of the boys accepted the visas to come to the UK because they thought it would help them to get there more quickly, because they thought the British would happily resettle them there. And that was also the thinking within the Central British Fund, because they had them on these training farms, particularly like Poulton House and Mill Isle, where they were training them to go and settle in kibbutzes in Palestine. So yes, there was. But the situation on the ground changed so radically from the arrival of the first group up until 1948 that it became more and more difficult to go to Palestine as the situation became more and more tense and the standoff between the British and the Jewish agency increased. I gave each of the interns quite clear instructions as to where they were to look for the boys. Some of them were given the copies of the list. So, for example, we have a list of the boys who were in the Jewish shelter who came in the fourth group, and that was assigned to one of the interns, Zach. And then each of the interns were then told where they should go to look up people. So, firstly, it's the United States Holocaust Museum, where they have the most amazing collection of lists you could ever imagine, and then also to Yad Vashem, because obviously at Yad Vashem people had registered the deaths of their relatives, and that was a way of us trying to find out who were the members of their families, because we didn't just want to tell one individual story. These are family stories in essence. And then was to check to see if they'd given any testimonies at the US Shoah Foundation, at the British Library, at the Imperial War Museum. And then other people came up giving testimonies at places that actually I had never heard of, at Pier 21 in Halifax in Canada, because one of the interesting stories that we discovered was that at least 100 of the boys were sent on the Canadian War Orphans Programme and travelled by boat to Halifax in Nova Scotia. And they, in the museum at Pier 21, they've been collecting testimonies from all the people who arrived in Canada, not just Holocaust survivors. So that was very interesting. Well, actually, it was a real number crunching situation, because whereas the interns who were all from the second and third generation, and even the fourth generation, were busy researching the individual stories of the boys, it was up to me actually to input all the data that they were handing over to me. And it was really extraordinary how patterns began to emerge very quickly. And one of the most amazing things for me was to discover that although the story is that there were 80 girls in the group of the boys, there were in fact well over 200 girls. And it's a mystery to me why anybody ever thought there were 80 girls. I went back to double check to see, did 80 girls arrive at Windermere? No, far more arrived at Windermere. Where this figure came from, I literally have no idea. So if there's anybody out there who knows it, I'd be extremely grateful if someone could drop us a line. But that was very extraordinary. And then it was the there was actually this yo-yoing in the number of the boys themselves, which went down as low as 710 at one point, and then shot up back to 730 when we discovered the fifth group of the boys. So they were a huge surprise. Then there was a huge surprise again that almost 300 of them came from the Carpathian Mountains region, which was a big surprise to us. And then also there was, to me, it was a great surprise to see just how many of the boys had actually come from Germany and from Austria. I already knew that we had two Italian girls and we had people from Hungary and Romania, but the huge number of Austrians and Germans really surprised me. And it shouldn't have done, because many of these were the youngest child Holocaust survivors who, of course, had been taken to Theresienstadt, and they're the ones who'd spent many years in the Theresienstadt ghetto before the arrival of the vast majority of the boys who came on death marches to Theresienstadt. One of the really interesting things that came out of the research was that just under 300 of the boys came from the Carpathian region. I'm not going to give you exact figures because some of them came from what I might call the Greater Carpathians, which includes parts of Romania like Satu Mare. But we've got a figure of around 290, and this is a really untold story. The Carpathians are one of those stories which have been forgotten and brushed out of history, and what actually happened in this very remote mountainous region is a fascinating story, and it's not well documented because it happened towards the end of the war. The boys in this story found themselves in ghettos and being deported to Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. In many ways it gave them a better opportunity to survive, but also it was extremely ruthless because they were taken immediately to Auschwitz. On the website we have two important maps. One is the map of the hostels in the UK. So you can go through and you can click on the icon of the hostel, and then you can read the story about the hostel. You can see who were the boys who were in it. And this Central British Fund tended to link them together because they had similar backgrounds, they had similar faith. Some were more religious, some were less religious. They also had different political opinions, and many of them had become very, very close friends. Now, the assumption was that they became close friends through their experiences in the ghetto and on the death marches, and then on the journey to the UK. But in fact, we began to see patterns emerging that they'd actually known each other before the war. And we discovered that many of them had come from the same town. Some of these towns were very small, others were big industrial cities like Łódź, where over 100 of the boys came from. And then you realise that their friendship went way back, and that their families were interlinked. And that was really very surprising to discover how many of them were cousins, because also these are the keys to survival, because in order to survive you had to have someone who could watch your back. So and who's better to watch your back than your cousin or your brother or your sister? Well, that was one of the big challenges about creating this website, because we wanted to create a website for the 45 aid members and for their families. Then on top of it, we knew that it was going to be used as an educational tool, and it would also not simply be used in classrooms in the UK, but we knew that other groups who were interested in researching the areas which we had thrown some light on would also then contact us. So we were working on a number of levels, which made it quite a challenge, I think, in the way that we constructed it. Firstly, we had to have quite a vigorous approach to how we constructed the profiles. We felt that everybody should have roughly the same length of profile. We wanted some equality here, and that whereas we could have, some people have written entire books and had books about them, written about them. No, you still got pretty much the same treatment from us, and you could follow on and if it was something you were particularly interested in, you could follow on with that. So that was the first thing with the profile, and then we began to see family patterns emerging, because people were with cousins, and because some of those cousins had gone to Canada or the United States or elsewhere, the inner core group of the boys hadn't actually known that this person had a cousin or even a brother or a sister. So we wanted to people to be able to flow through the profiles in order to discover their story. But then on top of that, we wanted to actually help the second, third, fourth, and future generations to actually understand the background to the boys' story. So that we wanted to look in detail about the places where the boys had come from. So if you click on the map of origins, you can then click on the name of the town, and then you can read a profile of the town, and then you can see the name of the other people who came there. And we were thinking that that's a way of you suddenly understanding why your dad or your grandpa or your great-grandpa was so friendly with somebody, because he actually came from the same town, but they never bothered to mention it to you. But that's also very important, I think, as an interactive tool in the classroom. So teachers can actually explain that the Holocaust was a European-wide event, because it's often in the classroom the focus is on Poland. And as I've said before, one of our big surprise discoveries was the fact that so many people came from the Carpathians in Czechoslovakia. So now in Britain we have a really strong Czechoslovak Holocaust story which can be taught in school, which I think is very important. The other thing that we were very keen to do, so when you click on the hostels pages and the interactive map of hostels, was actually to make this an archive for local historians. That's really important in the classroom, of course, because children can learn about the Holocaust within their own locality, which is obviously it's very fortunate for British school children that they don't have concentration camps down the road, but this gives them a local aspect to the story. But also it can involve local libraries, it can involve local communities in remembering this story. So the hostels page also functions in that fashion. And then the other thing that we were really keen to do was to talk about and discover the story of the people who actually helped the boys, because it tends to be overlooked. People forget the huge efforts that the British community made to accommodate the children, and how their story fitted into the Kindertransport and was in fact the last chapter of the Kindertransport, and to discover who and why and what these people were doing, what were their aspirations, and what were the challenges that they encountered in their jobs. Lots of the people who looked after the boys were the people who'd actually brought the Kindertransports to the UK. A lot of them were German Jews, which is very interesting. And they were, one thing that's interesting about the people who looked after them was they're actually a complete and utter rainbow of the Jewish community represented, which is quite unusual thing to happen. Nobody was in it for profit. In fact, I think people probably more than anything lost money through making their efforts to help the boys, just as they'd done through Kindertransport. There were certainly different approaches, because we were dealing with far less figures. Kindertransport is thousands and thousands of children, and here we're dealing with just over 700. But there were certain decisions which were made, was that they wouldn't, unless they were very small children, be fostered or put in families, and that they would stay within a Jewish environment. That was very important. But the entire rainbow of the British Jewish community it was involved in caring for the boys. And so it means that every single hostel that they were in had radically different approaches. You could find very religious hostels, which were, or seminaries. Then you could find less religious hostels, but they were religious Zionist hostels, and then you could then find non-religious hostels, and then you could find liberal hostels run by the West London Synagogue, and there you're dealing with quite wealthy Jews who are living in West London in large big white houses, and then on the other hand you would find that many of the people who were helping the children were actually refugees themselves and had come from Germany, Austria and Czechoslovakia before the war. And many of the people who were working in the hostels were actually also people who come on Kindertransport. The relationship between the boys and Kindertransport is something that also comes out quite strongly in the work that we've done. Well, they were all completely different. Firstly, there was the idea of looking after children in big country houses was not a British original idea. It was used on the continent. Child Holocaust survivors who were taken to France were looked after in large chateaux. In Czechoslovakia, even before some of the boys came to the UK, they'd been looked after in large stately homes. Now, there's a lot of good reason that you would have tried to take people to a large stately home. They had lots of grounds in which they could run off steam, but they were also protected because many of these children were actually German speaking, particularly the younger children. And of course, in the immediate post-war period, there was a lot of resentment towards Germany and anybody who might be speaking German. So to keep the children slightly separate, in that the younger children separate, was a logical thing to do. But also, nobody quite knew what the boys would actually be like, and so initially they wanted to try to keep them in a controlled environment. And in fact, I mean, it wasn't necessary. So as time moved on, they became much more flexible in the accommodation where they were caring for them. And some of them went to these training farms like Poulton House and Mill Isle in Northern Ireland, which were farms. So if you spent your time in the UK on a farm in Northern Ireland, it was radically different from spending your time in a stately home in Ascot. So the boys' experiences were very different. And then eventually, the fourth group who arrived had to be cared for in the Jewish shelter. Now, Jewish shelters in the East End of London, and was meant for destitute refugees when they arrived in the UK. It wasn't suitable for children, no way. Huge dormitories in the East End, right opposite a pub. Many of the boys have told me how they were going drinking in the pub, and Leonard Montefiore decided that this was not suitable, and that's the reason that 1,000 visas were not handed out, because the CBF ran out of money. They no longer had the money to put children in luxurious, well, not necessarily luxurious, but big stately homes, and that he did not want the children to be living in places like the Jewish shelter. I definitely think this is a project that's actually going to grow, because as soon as you complete one circle of research, you realise that there's something else that you haven't looked into carefully enough. And one of the things that I think is very interesting in the story of the boys is actually where they ended up and why they ended up there. In the course of our research, I discovered over 100 of the boys were sent on the Canadian War Orphans programme to Canada. I think that's a very interesting story and something that we should follow up on. And how many of them actually went to the United States, who went to South Africa. How many of them actually went home? We discovered one or two of them went back to Eastern Europe and made their lives there, which is also very interesting. And how many of them settled in Paris or spent time in France, where, of course, there was a very large refugee, well, not refugee, but where there was a very large community of people who had come from Eastern Europe and settled in Paris. So many of them had relatives in France. So the story reveals more and more as it goes on, I think. Well, as far as I'm concerned, I've got a list as long as my arm that I would like to hand over to people to research. I mean, one of the things that I'm very interested in at the moment is actually where and what organisations were actually caring for the children in Slovakia. There are a lot of children who were cared for in children's homes in Slovakia, and actually getting to the bottom of that, I think, is quite important, particularly when we want to tell the story properly of the youngest children and their experiences. I think that's a very important story. There's the stories of what they did immediately after the war are really fascinating and open up all kinds of stories which have remained buried and untold about the crucial years after the liberation and before the founding of the State of Israel. And I think also there are many other interesting stories within this story which can reveal many of the boys were ill because they'd worked in ammunitions factories. I think this is a very interesting story and can tell us an awful lot more about slave labour than we currently know. So I think one of the things that I like a lot is that a lot of young people are pursuing master's dissertations or undergraduate dissertations and PhDs around these kind of topics, and they get in contact with me wanting to pursue it. So I think there is a big interest, and which is why I think that the website as a whole is there as a very key resource for people like this, that they can go in and they can go, right, who experienced slave labour? Now I have some names of people, because you know, I know as a journalist you can't tell a story unless you've got personal intimate stories that you can through which you can tell a tale. I think it's really important because, you know, the vast majority of people who went through the Holocaust didn't choose to discuss it. They had so many pressures on them afterwards to build a new life, to make a living, you know, to look after their families, and they also had a zest for life, to get on with things. They were people of enormous agency, and that's one of the things that really strikes me about the boys. You know, that they had so much energy and so much drive, but it doesn't mean they necessarily talked in detail about what happened. I mean, even if you have a family background in which not very much happened, you'll find that actually you're not that clear as to who was related to who or what happened here. So it's bound to be more complicated when you don't have any other relatives to ask. But I think that it's very important that for the third and fourth generation to know the story and to tell it to their children, because nobody wants a story to be forgotten. I mean, that's a whole part of Jewish life. Is about telling the stories of what happened to the Jewish people and how they survived. And this is one really important chapter in that story. So it needs to be told within families, it needs to be told within bigger groups, and it needs to be told within nations. For me, as a historical journalist, one of the things that was very important in this project was not just to record the stories of the boys that we knew, but to make an attempt to build a skeleton of the stories of the boys that we really know nothing about. We know some people, we know their name, we know the city in which they were born, and the possible the day they were born and the year in which they were born. Now, once you know these sort of key pieces of information, you can start to key it into search engines in archives, and you can then start to pick up that there's a trace of them in this concentration camp and a trace of them here. And I'm really hoping that people will go online. They may not even have known that their mother or their father or their grandmother or their grandfather was a member of the boys. They may even never heard the term, because they may have been one of the members of the boys who left very quickly after they arrived in the UK. And if they find their family name online, they'll then discover this story and then help us to build this story. Because in many ways, it isn't a completed project. It's a project that we want people outside to engage with it. We want the boys to engage with it, to come and say, the boys themselves to look and say, hey, wait a minute, I remember that person, and their family members to say, yes, I remember that person, but I don't know much about them, but here's a photograph of them at my wedding, for example. So we can begin to put together these patterns. And I think that you can only really successfully tell and explain a story as time passes if you can tell it through these intensely personal tales, and the tales of friendship and survival, which is really the story of the boys.